The United States of America is leaving Europe. Now it has been officially announced at a meeting of European delegations with Pentagon officials this week in Washington. The Europeans were told that by 2027 Europe must take over most of NATO's responsibilities for conventional defense. Otherwise, the United States may stop participating in some of the alliance's coordination mechanisms. The point is that Europe itself should conduct intelligence, work on missile technologies, expand its armies, military-industrial complexes, and so on. Meanwhile, over time, the United States will simply become an auxiliary force rather than the decision-making center in NATO. Although, by the way, the United States still wants to take Northern Europe completely under its wing, probably because the Arctic is not far from there. European officials say the 2027 deadline is unrealistic. It's not due to Europe's lack of money or political will, they have both, but because they can't quickly replace key United States defense capabilities. Well, the Trump administration doesn't really care, and Trump himself isn't very interested in this. And obviously, yes, the Europeans are to blame for this themselves, because they should have started taking action back in 2022 or ideally even in 2014. But Trump himself is contradicting himself here. If in his national security strategy, which we discussed in the previous episode, Trump declares peace, stability, and prosperity in relations with Russia, then why should Europe prepare for war and arm itself? So where exactly is Trump lying then? My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like the video, leave any comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News. The link is in the description. We publish breaking news as soon as it comes in. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription to this channel using the links and details in the description of this video. You'll find options like bank details, PayPal, Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, and crypto wallets. So I would be grateful for any support you can give. So, the United States of America wants Europe to take on most of NATO's conventional defense capabilities, from intelligence to missiles, by 2027. Pentagon officials told diplomats in Washington about this earlier this week. They specifically summoned the Europeans to tell them, listen, you basically have a year left to rearm and get used to the fact that the Americans are leaving the continent. These are tight deadlines that some European officials found unrealistic. And the message, as reported by 5 Reuters sources familiar with the discussions, including an official United States representative, was delivered this week in Washington at a meeting between Pentagon officials overseeing NATO policy and several European delegations. As Reuters writes, shifting this burden from the United States to the European members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would radically change how the United States of America, one of the founders of the post-war alliance, interacts with its own country. Washington is still not satisfied with Europe's progress in increasing its defense capabilities after Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine in 2022. American officials have told their European counterparts that if Europe does not meet the deadline, that is, by 2027, the United States may stop participating in some defense coordination mechanisms. Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, 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 in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, they did not explain how the United States would assess Europe's progress in taking on a greater share of the burden. It is also unclear whether the 2027 deadline reflects the position of the Trump administration as a whole, or if it is the position of individual Pentagon officials. There is also major disagreement in Washington over the United States military's role in Europe, because part of Trump's team is actually calling to leave Europe, abandon it, and not defend it in any way. And one of these advocates is United States Vice President J.D. Vance, who openly says, listen, let Europe defend itself. Why get involved there? He openly says to pull out all our troops and withdraw our weapons. We'll stay in NATO, because if something like September 11 happens again and America needs help, that's why we remain members. But basically, Vance says that Europeans should be on their own. There is logic here, the question is how it's presented. Several European officials have stated that the 2027 deadline is unrealistic, regardless of how Washington assesses the progress. Because to replace some of the United States' capabilities in the short term, Europe needs more than just money and political will. Well, among other issues, NATO allies are facing delays in the production of military equipment they're trying to buy, including from the Americans, even though United States officials are urging Europe to purchase more American equipment. And some of the most sought-after American weapons and defense systems, such as the Patriot air defense system. If you order them today, they won't be delivered for several years. But then, what kind of rearmament by 2027 are we talking about? So the Europeans are saying the issue is not just about money or political will. Both things are already present and all Europeans are aware of what's happening. But there are just some restraining factors that won't allow, for example, strengthening the air and missile defense, which, by the way, is currently the responsibility of the Americans. Besides, within NATO, the United States also provides capabilities that you can't just go and buy. Well, for example, unique intelligence data, surveillance, reconnaissance, which, let me remind you, turned out to be crucial for the military operations of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, Ukraine, by receiving specifically American intelligence, was able to resist the Russians. Now Trump says that the United States no longer wants to share this intelligence information with Europeans and that Europe should handle its own intelligence. But as you know, this can't be done quickly either. NATO has acknowledged that allies must boost defense spending and transfer more of the conventional arms burden from the United States to Europe. European countries have generally agreed with President Trump's demands to take more responsibility for their own security and have promised to significantly increase defense spending. The European Union has set a goal to prepare the continent for self-defense by 2030 and has stated that it needs to address gaps specifically in air defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, cyber warfare munitions, and other areas. They also had logistics problems. But officials and analysts say that even this 2030 deadline is very, very ambitious. They say that because of how long Europe did nothing. Now the deadline seems unrealistic. He notes to Europe. It will seem. Forward futurism is completed at... Up, you have a childist. Strategic stability with the Russian Federation to ensure a Europe that stands on its own feet and takes responsibility for its own defense without domination by adversaries, to cultivate Europe's resistance to its current trajectory, to end and prevent the perception of NATO as an ever-expanding alliance. That is, in the national security strategy, Trump directly states that he intends somehow to reconcile Europe and Russia and build strategic stability between them. Trump himself assures that Putin will not attack Europe, and that Putin really wants peace in Ukraine. At the same time, more and more European and American military officials are saying that by 2027 Russia might attack Europe. Then there is only one question. Is Donald Trump simply trying to leave Europe? Before it's too late to completely remove any responsibility for a future war? To say, listen, you defended yourselves, but I don't just want to defend the Europeans, because they should have woken up much earlier, especially understanding who they were dealing with. Donald Trump's administration constantly claims that European allies should contribute more to the NATO alliance. But it's not always clear what the president's position is on NATO during the 2024 election campaign. Let me remind you, Trump often criticized European allies and stated that he would support President Vladimir Putin of Russia in his invasion of those NATO countries that do not spend their fair share on defense. He said directly, listen, if Putin attacks some European countries that don't pay enough, then let him attack. We won't even get involved there at all. On the contrary, let him attack, so it serves as a lesson to them. But at the annual NATO Leaders' Summit in June this year, Trump warmly praised European leaders for agreeing with the United States plan to increase the annual defense spending target for member states to 5% of their gross domestic product. In the following months, Trump wavered between taking a tougher stance toward Russia, still the main opponent and adversary of the North Atlantic Alliance, and more recently, a willingness to negotiate with Moscow over the war in Ukraine. European officials complained about being excluded from the negotiations, but that's how it is. At the meeting of NATO foreign ministers this week, United States Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau stated that it is clear that NATO allies must take responsibility for the defense of Europe. In principle, it's understandable and logical, but the point is that now Trump is setting deadlines for the Europeans, although we all know about Donald Trump's deadlines. But here it's unclear whether this will work on Europe the way it worked on Putin, because Trump also gave Putin an ultimatum. I recently, by accident, I just happened to come across my own old texts that I wrote for the episodes. And it made me smile when I read them in April. Look. Back in April, I wrote that Trump had shortened the deadline for Putin by 12 days, and that, well, something was supposed to happen. But much more than 12 days have passed, nothing happened, and it became obvious that all of Trump's deadline threats were empty. As for Russia, none of this works, it's all just talk and empty words. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye. Subtitles.